All right, the coming storm. First thing I want to do is make it clear that the notion of election day is very misleading and quite outdated. We don't have an election day anymore. We have an election process that goes on over several months of preparation and so forth, to run up to what we call election day. And then there's a lot of work that happens afterward. I think of it this way: election day is simply the last day to vote. It is not the only day to vote. In fact, it's not even the only day to vote in person anymore. Lots of states have early voting. So, but you are going to hear pounded in from the Trump campaign is that election day should be the end of the election. And they will begin to talk about everything afterward as, quote, overtime, as if it's not a legitimate part of the game. Just watch for that language. There are 78 days between November 3rd, the election, and January 20th, when we're going to have an inaugural. And there's many, many steps that have to be taken between November 3rd and January 20th. And every single one of them has the potential for disruption, or at least a challenge. The essential, and what I want to do today is walk you through the 78 days and what to watch for, and what to listen for, what the messaging will be, and so forth, in the hope that when things arrive, you will have some familiarity with what that looks like and what's happening. You won't be rushing to try to figure out the where are the electoral votes? Where do they meet? You'll know, you'll have a little guide ahead of time. So these are the assumptions that I'm operating on in preparing this. First of all, Mr. Trump will never concede. He will not do what every presidential candidate has done going back to some place in the early 1800s. And that is, once the outcome is clear, or even that hasn't been finalized, they concede. I don't think he will. Most people don't think he will. Second, on November 3rd, election day, there will be results announced, and Mr. Trump will be winning in quite a number of states. You know, of course, all the flat states, all the states in the middle and so forth, in the South. And the question, of course, is what's happening in the battleground states, the 6, no more than 8 states that will determine this election, just as they have in the last several cycles. However, some of those battleground states will change as all their votes are counted. It will shift from the Republican side to the Democratic side. And my last assumption, based on polling results so far, and yes, I know the polling was wrong 4 years ago, but it's different now and it's stronger. But my assumption is that if all the votes are counted and it follows the polling, Mr. Trump will lose. There's a further assumption in this: because he will not concede, he will fight everything. Before I launch into the details of the 78 days, I want to give you a little bit of background, because these are terms you're probably going to be hearing in the weeks to come. First of all, on the national level, the Republican Party has a serious demographic problem. This is not necessarily true for the Senate, the House, and certainly not for the legislatures. But on the national level, at the presidential level, they have a problem. They have lost 6 of the last 7 national elections in the popular vote. And it does not appear that that's going to be turning around anytime soon. Indeed, they are aware of this because the Republican Party, after the 2012 election, when Romney, to some, unexpectedly lost to Obama, the party had a deep introspection of what was going wrong. And they called it an autopsy. It's an interesting term. And the essential thing was, look, we're getting too old and too white and too rural. We need to expand our the attraction among different demographic groups. They specifically cited women, young people. They call it Hispanics, Latinx. They need to do better around the suburbs. And so they laid all out what they had to do. And then Mr. Trump came along, and he has done none of that. He's only interested in playing to the hardcore base. And that's quite clear to everyone now. Therefore, at least in this election, and really in others as well, the Republican Party recognizes that it is a shrinking constituency relative to the electorate as a whole. And so some of what they have been doing, and certainly what Trump's going to try to do this time, is rather than trying to win by attracting more voters, he's going to do it by subtracting the opposition voters. So how do you do that? How do you subtract voters on the other side? There are the 5 steps, basically. First, you prevent people from registering who you don't like. I'm not going to spend much time talking about that because we're at the end of that already, or will be very shortly. But the single best tool the Republicans have been able to deploy to prevent registration is voter ID. Some courts have used words like surgical precision to disenfranchise African-American voters. It's a very deliberate effort. Again, I won't go into a lot of detail, but that's number 1. Number 2, if people have registered, you discourage them from voting. There's various ways you can do that. Simply making politics awful is one way to do it. Denigrating your opponent. Attack ads are done because they work, not because they persuade people to vote for your side, but it persuades them not to vote for who you thought they were going to. And in this one in particular, Mr. Trump, and now Republicans are taking it up everywhere, are saying mail ballots are shot through with fraud. They won't make it. They're no good, in the hope that people who otherwise might have voted by mail simply won't, and because of the pandemic, simply won't go to the polls at all. You can also interfere with voting. There's 2 ways you can do that. One is you make it very difficult to vote. A great example this year is the Texas governor, when he issued a proclamation saying that he would allow for ballot drops to be used so that people could take their mail ballots, and rather than putting them in the U.S. mail, you could drop them in an official box and they'd be picked up and you knew they would be safe and you knew they had been received and you knew they had been received before the election. So the counties in Texas were doing that. And then he found out they were going to put them all over the place. And so he immediately stepped in and said no more than 1 drop box per county, which might make sense in the smaller rural counties, but in some counties there are as many as 4.5 million people to use a single drop box. That's just a single example of ways that you interfere with people's ability to get to a vote. You can reduce the number of polling places. You can reduce the number of machines you put in each polling place so that the lines get really long. All 3 of these are diabolically clever ways of doing it because those votes never materialize. They never have to be challenged. They don't have to be stopped. They simply disappear. And the people who wanted to vote but couldn't register, or their names were removed, or they get discouraged, or they can't find a polling place, or the line just is too long, and I'm sorry, I got 2 kids, I got to get home. Those people just disappear. They become part of the 50% of people who do not vote. But it also means that their support that they wanted to express disappears with them. So there's a political effect as well. If someone's registered and they wanted to vote and they managed to do their vote, then you can challenge the ballots. That's not illegal, that's not wrong, but there's different ways you can challenge ballots, and we'll talk about those. And then the ultimate one is stop counting. Once the Republicans have what appears to be a victory, do everything in your power to stop counting the ballots. That's why you're going to hear about things like overtime. And I'll go into that in some detail. In terms of counting votes, votes get counted at different times. We have early votes. Those are people who are actually able to go to a polling place and actually cast a vote right now. There are, of course, the in-person votes, which you do on election day. And then there are mail votes, which we now know can be returned in one of 3 ways. You put it in the post office, you can put it in a drop box, or you could walk down on election day and turn in your mail ballot to the people who are running the polling station. That is my preferred way of doing it. I love going down and talking with the people who run the polling and thanking them, maybe taking them something to eat. You know, they're taking a whole day to do this. So you can do that. All those, they're all different ways. However, you need to know when ballots are counted. And I'll be talking about that when I give you the timeline. Last thing I want to talk about as background, not the last thing, a little bit more. I want to discuss the red mirage and the blue shift. These are terms that I'm indebted to Barton Gellman in his Atlantic article for. They're used elsewhere. And I specifically want to talk about the mail ballots. Mail ballots, until recently, pretty much showed no differentiation between the parties. There was no partisan shift in mail ballots. If anything, there was a very slight advantage for the Republican Party because the people who use mail ballots have tended to be older. And older or more elderly voters have a demographic shift to the Republican Party, always have. That began to disappear after the year 2000, in large measure because a lot more people began to use mail ballots after the debacle in Florida, but also because people began to promote it. Now the partisan advantage generally was not there overall. There was a Stanford study that was done in June of this year that said, yeah, there's really not that big a difference, or there has not been until this year. What was different is that the ballots that come in urban areas, in precincts in urban areas, tend to be far larger in number, and that the counties who have to count them, therefore, have many, many more ballots to count. And counting mail ballots, as you'll see in a moment, is a laborious, slow, one-at-a-time process, unlike counting votes that are cast that day, which is the computer spits out a number and you're done. So the effect of that was we would see elections in which on election day or election night, it would appear that the Republican had succeeded in the provisional results. But as all the votes got counted over the days and sometimes weeks afterward, there would be what's called the blue shift that would take over. Let me give a couple of examples. Before I do, it's very important to understand some terminology. Election night results are always provisional. They're always incomplete. You can project, if you know what you're doing, you can project who the win is going to be based on the provisional ballots, especially if you know where they're coming in. And I have done that on election night. I've had election night parties. We start calling states, right away, just based on 5% of the precincts in. But those are very provisional. Those are not final at all. I mean, the ballot has been cast, the vote has been cast, but the count is not done. Second, most states count their mail ballots beginning on election day. And therefore they actually get counted, most of them, after election day. And that's always been true. There's nothing odd about that. It just takes a long time. Because remember, the election guys, they spent 364 days a year, strike that. They spend 364 days 1 year and 0 in the other years doing other things. And then one day they all of a sudden got to do all this stuff. And so it takes some time. And it usually takes anywhere from a week to a couple of weeks. I can think of some elections where it's actually gone 30 days before you have actual final certified results. And we'll talk about the certification process in a moment. So don't expect actual final results ever until later. That is where the Trump campaign is going to go. They are going to attack that process between the vote and the certification. I mentioned mail ballots. It's very difficult to process them because you have to do every single one of them by hand. The steps involved in counting a mail ballot, the ballot comes in an envelope and you have to check the signature on the outside of the envelope to make sure it is in fact a registered voter. And the registered voter is supposed to go to. And you check that signature, make sure that registered voter signed it. You then open the envelope. There'll be a second envelope inside called the security envelope. You need to make sure it's there. You need to make sure it's sealed. You need to make sure it also is signed correctly and the name of the voter has been placed upon it. You then open it and you check the ballot. And you have to look at the ballot to see if it legibly and clearly shows an intention to vote for someone and it does not overvote, or it's not a spoiled ballot. They started to write one person and they say, oh, I don't want that, cross it out and do another one. That's an invalid ballot. A ballot that does not have a signature is invalid. We'll talk more about the challenges that we're going to see. There was a study done in Philadelphia by the Republican Party in the primary this year to look for different things that can be challenged, and we'll take a look at those. The mail ballots this year are going to be massive, potentially upwards of 200 million people could cast ballots that way. They won't all do it, but we could easily see 40 or 50 million mail ballots is way more than we normally see it. The second thing you should understand is that so far, in terms of looking at who has applied for a ballot, where you have to apply, and where are they being returned, in which precincts are they being returned, we are seeing massive differences between the Republicans and the Democrats. Mr. Trump has been denigrating mail ballots to everybody, and his listeners, his followers rather, are listening, and they're not doing it. The data I'm seeing are showing that Democrats are getting mail ballots and returning them disproportionate to Republicans as much as 3 or 4 to 1. And that is causing panic, by the way, on the ground among local Republican officials who said, fine, Mr. Trump, you can fight about this stuff, but my guy running for state Senate, my guy running for mayor, my guy running for the House seat is getting affected by this. Because of what appears to be a vast overrepresentation of Democrats, first of all, that is going to continue. Polling data in states like Florida and Wisconsin show that a majority of Democrats are reporting they intend to use a mail ballot, and a very small percentage of Republicans are saying they intend to do it. In Wisconsin, it's 55% of the Democrats are going to vote by mail. It's 15% of the Republicans. Therefore, you should expect that the count is going to go longer, and it is going to be a massive blue shift because so many of the votes will not be counted by Election Day and will have to come in later. All right. Therefore, what appears to be the outlines of the Trump campaign plan, and this is not me divining, this is just looking at sometimes off the record comments and so forth. Number one, of course, is prevent registration. And they've worked on it in the states where they could. Second, try to minimize early voting. Reduce the number of polling places. Reduce the number of days they're open. Georgia, a couple of years ago, stopped putting polling places out on the Sunday before Election Day because they found out that Black churches, they would have their service, whatever it might be, and then they would all troop to the polls together. So there's different ways of doing that. Discouraging voting. We've talked about that already. There's lots of that going on. A big one, delegitimize the mail ballots. Use the word fraud as often and as loudly as possible. There is zero evidence of fraudulent ballots being cast by mail. Zero. Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. There is one example that we know of in the last 20 years, and that was a Republican operative in North Carolina in 2018 who put in fraudulent requests for hundreds of voters to his own address, filled them out, and then returned them. Now, we're not talking the brightest person on the planet because he filled them all out in the same ink with the same handwriting. And guess what? The election officials caught it and said something's wrong, and they voided the election. But that is the only example we know of. There's a more subtle one happening here. I'm beginning to believe that the Trump drumbeat against mail ballots, producing that strong skew toward Democratic votes coming in by mail, is not an accident. There is some unrest on the Republican side saying, my God, my God, my God, in Florida, all the old people vote by mail. Stop telling them not to do that. I believe he's willing to take a slight hit on the Republican side because skewing toward Democrats gives his lawyers a target after the election. If you just go after all the mail ballots, you're going to take out more Democratic votes than Republican ones. And then ultimately, and we'll talk about this, I believe the goal is to stop the count after Election Day. They will do everything they can legally, I don't want to say illegally, non-legally, and physically to stop the count, to prevent the blue shift from operating. So let's take a look at the presidential election process.